She vanished on her first day. A decade later, a massage flyer reveals his wife's horrifying fate and a powerful CEO's dark secret. His desperate hunt for truth ignites a deadly battle for justice. The flyer, innocuously tucked under his windshield wiper, was an assault of lurid pinks and suggestive silhouettes. Michael Carter, his face etched with the weariness of a decade spent searching, almost tossed it aside. Another piece of city detritus, another advertisement for services he had no interest in. He was leaving his sparsely attended weekly support group for families of missing persons, a ritual that had become more about shared, quiet despair than active hope. The fluorescent lights of the community center's parking lot cast long, distorted shadows, mirroring the contortions of his own grief. It was the 24th of June, 2035, 10 years to the day since Isabel had vanished. 10 years of his life evaporating into a mist of unanswered questions and dead-end leads. He pulled the flyer free, intending to crumple it, but a face in the corner, small and grainy, snagged his attention. It was a woman, dressed in a ridiculously skimpy maid outfit, her smile forced, her eyes distant. But beneath the artifice, the cheap wig, and the heavy makeup, there was something hauntingly familiar in the delicate curve of her jawline, the slight upturn of her nose. Michael's breath hitched. His heart, a dormant thing for so long, began to hammer against his ribs with a force that stole his breath. He stumbled back against his car, the metal cool against his suddenly clammy skin. His hand, clutching the flyer, trembled violently. Isabel? The name was a raw whisper, torn from a place of profound disbelief and a sudden, terrifying surge of adrenaline. It couldn't be. Not after all this time. Not like this. He fumbled for his reading glasses, his fingers clumsy and uncooperative. The image sharpened, and with it, the sickening lurch in his stomach intensified. The woman in the flyer was older, undeniably, lines of hardship etched around her eyes that hadn't been there a decade ago. But the eyes themselves, despite the vacant expression they held, were unmistakably Isabel's, the same shade of deep sapphire that had captivated him from their very first meeting. The small, almost invisible scar just above her left eyebrow, a memento from a childhood tumble, was there, partially obscured by a stray strand of the cheap wig. A wave of nausea washed over him. Isabel, his brilliant, vibrant Isabel, who had been so excited to start her new job at Sterling & Vance, one of the city's most prestigious financial corporations. She had practically danced out of their apartment that Monday morning, the 24th of June, 2025, her briefcase in hand, a radiant smile on her face, promising to call him at lunch. That call never came. By evening, a knot of unease had tightened in Michael's chest. By the next morning, it had blossomed into full-blown panic. Sterling & Vance claimed she'd never arrived. No record of her clocking in, no security footage of her entering the building. The cameras on her supposed entry route had been mysteriously malfunctioning that specific morning. Her newly assigned office remained empty, her nameplate not yet affixed to the door. It was as if she had been erased, not just from the company's records, but from existence itself. The police investigation had been a frustrating exercise in futility. Detectives interviewed a stoic CEO, Jonathan Reeves, whose condolences felt rehearsed and insincere. They spoke to a few tight-lipped employees who claimed to have never seen Isabel. The security guard on duty that morning, a man named Carlos, initially reported seeing a woman matching Isabel's description enter the main lobby, looking a little lost, around 8:55 a.m. He'd even remembered her asking for directions to the new employee orientation, but his statement was later amended, claiming he might have been mistaken, confused by the morning rush. The pressure from Sterling & Vance's legal team had been immense, Michael recalled with a fresh surge of bitterness. The case went cold within months, officially classified as a voluntary disappearance, despite Michael's desperate insistence that Isabel would never leave him, never abandon her life, her dreams. The official narrative painted her as perhaps overwhelmed by the new job, or having second thoughts about her life choices. It was a narrative that protected the pristine image of Sterling & Vance, a corporation known for its philanthropy and powerful connections. Michael knew it was a lie, a carefully constructed facade to mask something far more sinister. Now, this flimsy piece of paper, advertising Celestial Touch Massage, where your fantasies come true, threatened to rip that facade to shreds. The address listed was in a seedy, industrial part of town, an area known for its transient population and illicit activities. The thought of Isabel, his Isabel, in such a place forced into time. He couldn't complete the thought. A cold dread, far more potent than any he had felt in years, seeped into his bones. He looked around the deserted parking lot, a sudden paranoia gripping him. Was he being watched? Was this some kind of cruel, elaborate hoax? But the scar, the eyes, they were irrefutable. His mind raced, a chaotic jumble of past pain and present urgency. He had to know. He had to find out if the woman in this disgusting flyer was truly his long-lost wife. The drive to the address on the flyer was a blur. Michael's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed, unseeing on the road ahead. The city lights smeared past, a kaleidoscope of neon and shadow. He parked a block away from the Celestial Touch Massage, the building a dilapidated two-story structure with flickering neon sign that cast a sickly green glow on the grimy sidewalk. The windows were blacked out, and a faint, thumping bass line emanated from within. This was a world away from the gleaming steel and glass tower of Sterling and Vance. A world away from the bright, hopeful future he and Isabel had planned. How could she have ended up here, if it was indeed her? The doubt still gnawed at him, a desperate attempt by his mind to shield itself from a potentially devastating truth. He took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and desperation. He got out of the car, the flyer clutched in his hand like a talisman. His legs felt heavy, each step an effort. This was it. After 10 years of searching, of clinging to a sliver of hope so thin it was almost invisible, he was on the verge of an answer. An answer that might destroy him, but an answer nonetheless. The question that had haunted his every waking moment for a decade echoed in his mind, louder and more insistent than ever. What happened to Isabel Moore? And now, a new, more terrifying question emerged. What had they done to her? 10 years had carved Michael Carter into a man starkly different from the hopeful software engineer who had kissed his wife goodbye that fateful Monday. His once neatly trimmed brown hair was now streaked with premature grey, often unkempt, a testament to restless nights and forgotten self-care. His shoulders, which used to be broad and straight, carried a perpetual slump, the invisible weight of a decade of grief and unanswered questions pressing down on him. His eyes, though, held the most dramatic change. They were Isabel's favorite feature, once sparkling with humor and intelligence. Now they were hollowed, shadowed, and possessed a piercing intensity, the look of a man who had stared into the abyss for too long and refused to blink. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it was a fleeting, melancholic curve of the lips that never quite reached his eyes. The vibrant energy that had defined him was replaced by a quiet, almost unnerving stillness, the calm of a man who had weathered an unending storm and was still standing, albeit battered and scarred. Their apartment, once filled with Isabel's laughter and the scent of her favorite jasmine tea, had become a meticulously preserved mausoleum. He hadn't changed a thing. Her side of the closet still held her clothes, the smart business suits she'd painstakingly chosen for her new role at Sterling and Vance, the brightly colored sundresses she wore on their weekend trips to the coast, the soft, worn cardigan she'd curl up in on chilly evenings. Her easel stood in the corner of the living room, a canvas stretched taut, bearing the faint charcoal outlines of a landscape she had been planning to paint, a scene from their last vacation in Vermont. Her collection of classic literature, from Austen to Tolstoy, lined the bookshelves, their spines uncracked since her fingers last touched them. A half-finished knitting project, a vibrant blue scarf intended for him, lay in a basket by her favorite armchair, the needle still holding the stitches as if she'd merely stepped away for a moment. These objects were not just mementos, they were anchors, tangible proof of the life that had been stolen, the vibrant, intelligent woman who had been erased. Isabel Moore had been a force of nature, a whirlwind of passion, intellect, and kindness. She'd graduated top of her class with a degree in finance, but her heart had always belonged to the arts. She could discuss intricate financial models with the same enthusiasm she reserved for debating the merits of a Rothko painting. She was ambitious, yes, driven to make her mark in the competitive world of finance, but her ambition was tempered by a deep sense of empathy. She volunteered at a local animal shelter, tutored underprivileged children in math, and dreamt of one day starting her own foundation to support young female artists. Michael remembered the night before she started at Sterling and Vance. They had sat on their small balcony, sharing a bottle of cheap champagne to celebrate. The city lights twinkled below, a million promises of a bright future. "This is it, Michael," she'd said, her eyes shining brighter than any star. "This job, it's a stepping stone. In 5 years, I'll be a senior analyst. In 10, maybe a director. And then," she'd paused, a playful smile on her lips, "then I'll have enough saved to open that little gallery I've always talked about." He'd pulled her close, inhaling the familiar scent of her hair. "And I'll be your first and most devoted customer," he'd promised. The memory, once a source of warmth, now felt like a shard of glass twisting in his gut. Her dreams, their shared dreams, had shattered into a million irreparable pieces on that first day. His search had been relentless, an obsession that consumed his life and savings. He'd hired and fired a string of private investigators, each one starting with confident assurances and ending with apologetic shrugs. He'd pored over police reports until the ink faded, memorized every grainy security still from the streets around Sterling and Vance, desperately looking for a glimpse of her that wasn't there. He'd created websites, plastered missing person posters with her smiling face across the city, then the state, then further. He followed every lead, no matter how tenuous, from supposed sightings in distant cities to cryptic, anonymous emails that led nowhere. Friends had urged him to move on, to accept the unacceptable. His parents had gently suggested grief counseling. But for Michael, moving on was tantamount to betraying Isabel. Hope, however frail, was the only thing that kept him tethered to sanity. And now, that hope had taken on a grotesque, terrifying new form in the image on the flyer. The Isabel he knew, confident, radiant, full of life, was a universe away from the vacant-eyed woman in the maid costume. The stark contrast was a physical blow, making the reality of her potential degradation almost unbearable. His Isabel, who argued passionately for women's rights, who despised exploitation in any form, how could she be that woman? He stood before the entrance to Celestial Touch Massage. The thumping bass from within seemed to vibrate through the soles of his shoes, a primal, unsettling rhythm. The air was thick with the smell of cheap disinfectant, stale cigarette smoke, and an undercurrent of something cloyingly sweet, like overripe fruit. A single bare bulb above the doorway cast harsh shadows, making the peeling paint and grimy brickwork look even more sinister. This place was the antithesis of everything Isabel had ever represented. It was a haven for the city's underbelly, a place where dreams went to die, not where they were nurtured. He glanced down at the flyer still clutched in his hand, his knuckles white. The woman's face stared back at him, a silent accusation. If it was her, what horrors had she endured to bring her to this? And if it wasn't, was he merely projecting his desperate hope onto a stranger, a cruel trick of a grief-addled mind? The uncertainty was a torment. For 10 years, he had searched for a ghost, a memory. Now, he might be about to confront a flesh-and-blood reality, a reality that could be far more devastating than the endless void of her absence. He could turn around, walk away, retreat back into the familiar landscape of his grief, a grief he had learned to navigate, to live with. But the eyes in the picture, Isabel's eyes, held him captive. He had to know, even if the truth shattered the last vestiges of his carefully constructed world. His hand reached for the doorknob, a cheap, cold metal sphere. It felt like crossing a threshold into another realm, a descent into an unknown darkness from which there might be no return. The pounding in his chest was deafening, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of his decision. He pushed the door open. The interior of Celestial Touch Massage was a suffocating assault on the senses. Michael stepped from the grimy twilight of the street into a dimly lit reception area, the air thick with the cloying sweetness he'd smelled outside, now mingled with the acrid undertone of stale incense and cheap cleaning chemicals. Walls painted a garish, peeling crimson were adorned with faded posters of women in suggestive, almost theatrical Far Eastern attire, their smiles as artificial as the plastic cherry blossoms wilting in a dusty vase on a rickety counter. The thumping bass he'd heard outside was more defined here, a relentless, primal beat that seemed to seep up from the floorboards, vibrating through his very bones. It was a sound that spoke of hidden rooms and illicit activities, a stark contrast to the sterile, almost silent corridors of Sterling and Vance he had paced so many times, begging for information, for any scrap of concern. Behind the counter, a woman with heavily made-up eyes and a bored expression looked up from her phone, her gum cracking audibly. She was young, too young perhaps, with a hardness around her mouth that belied her years. Her gaze swept over Michael, a quick, dismissive appraisal. "Yeah? You lost, Grandpa, or looking for a rub-down?" she asked, her voice raspy, coated with a layer of indifference that was chillingly familiar. It was the same tone, albeit cruder, that he had encountered from the polished, expensive receptionists at Sterling and Vance a decade ago. The same veiled contempt, the same implication that his presence was an inconvenience, his grief an unwelcome intrusion into their orderly world. He remembered Jonathan Reeves, the CEO, a man whose tailored suits probably cost more than Michael earned in a month. Reeves had offered condolences that felt like they were read from a script, his eyes cool and unreadable. "Mr. Carter," he'd said, his voice smooth as oiled machinery. "While this is unfortunate, Miss Moore was not yet an official employee. There's very little we can offer in terms of information. Our security protocols are robust. It seems she simply chose not to arrive." A blatant lie considering Carlos, the security guard's initial, albeit later retracted, statement. The police too had become a wall of polite but firm dismissal. After the initial flurry of activity, the interviews and the futile search for footage, Detective Miller, the lead investigator, had started avoiding his calls. "Michael," he'd said eventually, his voice tired, "we've explored every avenue. There's no sign of foul play. People leave their lives behind sometimes. It happens." The official file, stamped voluntary disappearance, case closed due to lack of evidence, felt like a personal betrayal, a systemic shrug in the face of his agony. The system, designed to protect and serve, had instead chosen silence and expediency, leaving him to navigate the labyrinth of his loss alone. Sterling and Vance, with its army of lawyers and PR specialists, had ensured its pristine reputation remained untarnished. Isabel's disappearance a mere footnote, quickly forgotten by the public. Michael pushed these bitter memories aside, focusing on the woman before him. He held out the flyer, his hand steady despite the tremor in his soul. "I'm looking for this woman," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Her name is Isabel. Or it was." The attendant glanced at the flyer, her chewing momentarily ceasing. Her eyes beneath the thick lashes flickered with something, recognition, or was it just surprise at his directness? She pushed the flyer back across the counter with a lacquered fingernail. "Never seen her," she said flatly. "Lots of girls come and go. We don't do fantasy maid service here, mister. Standard menu. You want a massage or you want to waste my time?" Her denial was too quick, too practiced. Michael had spent 10 years honing his ability to read people, to detect the subtle shifts in expression, the telltale signs of evasion. "I'm willing to pay for information," he said, pulling out his wallet. He laid a $100 bill on the counter. "Just tell me if you've seen her. Maybe she uses a different name now." The woman eyed the money, then him, a flicker of calculation in her eyes. "Look," she said, her voice dropping slightly, "even if I knew something which I don't, talking about girls here, it's not smart. For me or for you." She gestured vaguely towards the back, where a beaded curtain swayed, obscuring whatever lay beyond. "Boss doesn't like questions." "Your boss," Michael pressed, "would he know her?" He added another $100 bill to the first. "This is important, more important than you can imagine." The woman hesitated. She glanced towards the beaded curtain, then back at Michael. The indifferent mask slipped for a moment, revealing a hint of something else. Fear, perhaps, or a weary pragmatism. "Names don't mean much here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she deftly pocketed the money. "Faces change, hair color, everything. But there's a new girl. Came in maybe 6 months ago. Quiet, keeps to herself. Got those sad eyes, you know. Kinda looks like your picture, if you squint and imagine her 10 years rougher." Michael's heart leaped, a painful, hopeful surge. "Where is she? Can I see her?" The attendant shook her head. "Not like that. She's working. Room 7, end of the hall. But you didn't hear it from me. And if anyone asks, you just picked a room, okay? Standard deep tissue. She slid a small numbered plastic key across the counter. "And for your sake, I hope you're wrong about her. Or right. Whatever it is you're hoping for." Her expression was unreadable, a strange mix of cynicism and something that might have been a fleeting spark of sympathy. The ambiguity of her statement, the casual cruelty of the place, the way human beings were reduced to room numbers and services, churned Michael's stomach. This was the dark underbelly that society preferred to ignore, the place where the Isabels of the world, if this lead proved true, could be lost and forgotten, their identities stripped away layer by painful layer. The indifference he'd faced from the authorities and the corporate giant now manifested in a more visceral, more degraded form in this shadowy establishment. They weren't just indifferent, they were complicit in the erasure of a person. He picked up the key. It felt cold and foreign in his palm. Room 7. This could be it. The end of a decade-long search, or the beginning of a new nightmare. The music seemed to pulse louder. The air grew heavier. He was willingly walking into the heart of something dangerous, armed with nothing but a grainy photograph and a desperate, flickering hope. The system had failed him, failed Isabel. Now, he was on his own, navigating a world where justice was a foreign concept and survival was the only currency. The brief, almost imperceptible tremor of fear in the attendant's eyes when she mentioned her boss was a stark warning. He was no longer just a grieving husband. He was an intruder in a dangerous, hidden world. The corridor leading away from the reception area was even dimmer than the entrance, lit by sporadic, flickering wall sconces that cast long, dancing shadows, turning mundane objects a discarded cleaning bucket, a stack of folded towels into grotesque, menacing shapes. The crimson paint of the reception gave way to a sickly mustard yellow, peeling in damp patches near the floor. The thumping bass was louder here, almost a physical pressure against Michael's eardrums, punctuated by muffled sounds from behind the closed doors he passed. A low murmur of voices, a sudden burst of laughter that sounded forced and hollow, a creak of bed springs. Each sound was a fresh stab of anxiety, painting a grim picture of the activities within these walls. The air was heavy, stagnant, thick with the lingering scent of cheap perfume, stale sweat, and an undercurrent of despair that seemed to cling to the very fabric of the building. Michael clutched the plastic key to room 7. Its cheapness, a stark contrast to the immense weight of what it might unlock. His footsteps, on the worn, threadbare carpet that squelched faintly underfoot, seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence between the thumps of the music. With each step, memories, sharp and unsolicited, rose from the depths of his mind, superimposing themselves onto the squalor around him. He passed a door marked Room 3, a faint, almost imperceptible scent of jasmine wafted from beneath it, immediately transporting him back to their sun-drenched apartment. Isabel had loved jasmine. She grew a small plant on their balcony, and its delicate fragrance often filled their home. He remembered her, one Sunday morning, her face alight with righteous indignation, as she read an article about corporate exploitation in developing countries. "It's obscene, Michael," she'd said, her sapphire eyes flashing. "Companies that build empires on the suffering of others. They talk about ethics, about corporate responsibility, but it's all just words, a veneer to hide the rotten core. Someone has to hold them accountable." Her passion, her unwavering moral compass, had been one of the things he loved most about her. How could that woman, his Isabel, be in a place like this? The cognitive dissonance was a physical ache. He continued down the hall, the numbers on the doors climbing slowly. 4, 5, 6. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly before him. Another memory surfaced, this one colder, tinged with a nameless dread that had settled in his gut in the weeks following her disappearance. He recalled a brief, awkward conversation with one of Isabel's soon-to-be colleagues from Sterling and Vance, a junior analyst he'd bumped into during one of his desperate visits to the corporate headquarters. The young man, flustered and avoiding eye contact, had mumbled something about Isabel being too inquisitive during a pre-employment HR briefing, asking questions about offshore accounts and subsidiary transparency that seemed to make the HR manager uncomfortable. At the time, Michael had dismissed it as corporate paranoia, Isabel's natural curiosity being misinterpreted. Now, in the suffocating confines of this hallway, the comment took on a more sinister hue. Had her keen intellect, her refusal to accept things at face value, inadvertently marked her as a threat to someone powerful within Sterling and Vance? The image of Jonathan Reeves resurfaced, his smooth, unlined face a mask of polite indifference. Reeves had built Sterling & Vance into a global financial behemoth, a company lauded for its aggressive growth and record profits. But whispers had always circulated in the financial district, rumors of ruthless tactics, shadowy deals, and a corporate culture that valued profit above all else. Michael had tried to voice his suspicions to Detective Miller, suggesting that Isabel might have stumbled upon something illicit, something the corporation wanted to keep hidden. Miller had listened, his expression unreadable, then had gently steered the conversation back to the voluntary disappearance theory. "Mr. Carter," he'd said, a touch of weariness in his voice, "Sterling & Vance is a multi-billion-dollar corporation with a legal team that could bury us all in paperwork. Unless you have concrete evidence of wrongdoing, my hands are tied." Concrete evidence. That was the wall he had repeatedly slammed into. He was nearing the end of the corridor now. Room 7, the last door on the left. The music seemed to pulse with a manic energy. A memory of Carlos, the security guard at Sterling & Vance, flashed vividly in his mind. Carlos had been an older man, with kind eyes and a weary stoop. On Michael's first frantic visit to the company, the day after Isabel vanished, Carlos had been visibly distressed. "Si, senor," he'd said, his voice low and hesitant, his gaze darting nervously towards the main security desk. "I saw her. A beautiful lady like the picture you have. She asked for the orientation room, seemed a little nervous but excited." He'd even described the navy blue blazer Isabel had been so proud of. 2 days later, when Michael returned with the police, Carlos's story had changed. He'd looked pale, his earlier warmth replaced by a rigid formality. I might have been mistaken, Detective," he'd stammered, not meeting Michael's eyes. "So many people come through these doors. I can't be sure." Michael had seen the fear in the older man's eyes, the subtle tremor in his hands. He knew Carlos had been pressured, threatened even. But by whom? And why was it so important to erase Isabel's presence from the building that morning? The company had claimed the surveillance cameras covering that specific entrance and lobby area were down for unscheduled maintenance between 8:30 a.m. and 9:30 a.m. on the day Isabel disappeared. An incredibly convenient malfunction. The flyer, the maid outfit, the vacant eyes. It was all a horrifying puzzle, and the pieces were slowly, agonizingly, beginning to coalesce. If Isabel had indeed discovered something damning about Sterling & Vance, something that threatened Reeves or his inner circle, they would have had the motive, and certainly the means, to silence her. But to what end? And how did that connect to a seedy massage parlor 10 years later? The thought of what could have happened in the intervening decade, the horrors she might have endured to survive, was a chasm of terror Michael couldn't bring himself to contemplate fully. He stood before room 7. The cheap plastic key felt slick in his sweating palm. The door itself was featureless, indistinguishable from the others, except for the tarnished brass 7 screwed crookedly into the wood. From within, he could hear nothing but the muffled, relentless throb of the bass. No voices, no laughter, no creaking springs, just an unnerving silence beneath the oppressive music. This was it. 10 years of searching, of hoping, of despairing, had led him to this door, in this godforsaken place. He had unearthed fragments of the past, glimpses of systemic indifference and corporate ruthlessness. He recalled the cold, dismissive facade of Sterling & Vance, the subtle fear in Carlos's recanted testimony, Isabel's own passionate words about corporate accountability. These memories, once disparate and confusing, now seemed to point towards a truth far more complex and terrifying than a simple disappearance. He raised his hand, the key poised. The truth, or whatever fragment of it lay beyond this door, was inches away. His heart hammered against his ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. He had to know. He had to. Michael's hand trembled as he inserted the cheap plastic key into the lock of room 7. It turned with a reluctant click. He pushed the door open slowly, his breath caught in his throat, bracing himself for whatever lay beyond. The room was small, oppressively so. A single, grimy window, high up and barred, let in a sliver of weak grey light that did little to dispel the gloom. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of unwashed linen and despair. A narrow bed was pushed against one wall, its thin mattress covered with a threadbare, faded floral sheet. On the bed, a figure lay curled on her side, facing away from the door, a mass of dark, tangled hair obscuring her face. She was utterly still. "Isabel," Michael whispered, the name a fragile thing in the suffocating silence. The figure didn't move. For a terrifying moment he thought she might be... He couldn't complete the thought. He took a hesitant step into the room, then another, his shoes scuffing on the bare linoleum floor. The only sound was the distant, muffled throb of the bass from the main part of the building and the frantic thumping of his own heart. "Isabel?" he said again, louder this time, his voice cracking. Slowly, agonizingly, the figure stirred. She shifted, and then, with what seemed like immense effort, she turned over. Michael's world tilted, his knees buckled, and he had to reach out to the grimy wall to steady himself. It was her, older, yes, profoundly so. The vibrant youth that had danced in her eyes was extinguished, replaced by a haunting emptiness. Her sapphire eyes, though clouded with a deep, unutterable weariness, were undeniably Isabel's. Her face was gaunt, etched with lines of hardship that spoke of years of suffering. Her hair, once a glossy chestnut, was dull and streaked with grey. She wore a simple, faded cotton shift that hung loosely on her thin frame. There were faint, bluish bruises on her visible arm, stark against her pale skin. But it was her, his Isabel, found. A choked sob escaped him. He rushed to her side, sinking to his knees beside the low bed. "Isabel, oh my God, Isabel, it's me. It's Michael." She stared at him, her eyes wide, unfocused for a moment, as if struggling to penetrate a thick fog. Then, a flicker, a tiny, almost imperceptible spark of recognition deep within their depths. Her lips, pale and chapped, trembled. She tried to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound emerged. She raised a trembling hand, her fingers brushing his cheek. Her touch was feather-light, yet it sent an electric shock through him. "Michael?" Her voice was a ghost of its former self, fragile and hoarse, as if unused for a very long time. But it was her voice. Tears streamed down Michael's face, tears of sorrow, of relief, of a pain so profound it had no name. "Yes, Issy, yes, it's me. I found you. I never stopped looking." He gently took her hand, his own calloused fingers enveloping her delicate, bony ones. Hers were cold, so cold. She continued to stare at him, her brow furrowed as if trying to reconcile his presence with the grim reality of her surroundings. Her gaze drifted around the squalid room, then back to him. A single tear escaped the corner of her eye and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. "How?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The flyer," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I saw your picture on a flyer for this place." The shame and rage he felt at her circumstances were a burning inferno within him. Isabel's eyes widened slightly, a flash of fear, or perhaps understanding, crossing her face. She tried to sit up, a grimace of pain flitting across her features. Michael gently helped her, propping her against the thin pillows. She was so frail, a mere shadow of the vibrant woman he remembered. They watch," she whispered, her gaze darting towards the door. "Always watching. Who, Isabel? Who did this to you?" Michael's voice was raw with controlled fury. Was it Reeves? Sterling and Vance? He needed to know. Isabel didn't answer directly. Her gaze dropped to her own hands, which were twisting nervously in her lap. Then, her eyes fixed on something around her neck, a thin, tarnished silver chain. Michael hadn't noticed it before. It was the locket he had given her on their first anniversary, a small, heart-shaped antique. He had assumed it was long gone, lost like everything else. Her trembling fingers fumbled with the clasp. It was stiff, and she struggled. Michael gently pushed her hands aside. "Let me." His fingers, more nimble despite his own tremor, worked at the tiny clasp. It sprang open. He expected to see the miniature, faded photograph of them from their wedding day, smiling and oblivious to the darkness that lay ahead. But the photo was gone. Instead, nestled tightly within one half of the locket, was a minuscule, tightly folded square of what looked like extremely thin paper, almost like onion skin, covered in tiny, precise handwriting, and in the other half, glinting dully, was a tiny, wafer-thin memory card. Michael stared at it, his mind reeling. A memory card? And an almost microscopic note? Isabel's eyes met his, and in them, for the first time since he'd entered the room, He saw a flicker of her old fire, her sharp intellect. "Sterling." "Vance," she breathed, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "Reeves. It was always Reeves. I found their real ledger." Her words hit Michael with the force of a physical blow. The real ledger, not just financial irregularities. What could be so damning that it warranted 10 years of this living hell? She gestured weakly towards the locket. The paper, names, dates, accounts, the card, copies, scans, everything. They move people, not just money. Her voice broke on a sob. "Girls, so many girls. Sterling and Vance. It's a channel, a global network. Human trafficking." The social context he'd read about, the horrifying truth he'd vaguely suspected but never dared to fully articulate, was now staring him in the face, confirmed by the broken woman who was his wife. Sterling and Vance, the prestigious financial institution, was a front for something monstrous. Jonathan Reeves, the celebrated CEO, was a monster. Isabel hadn't just stumbled upon financial fraud. She had uncovered an operation of unimaginable evil. This was why they couldn't let her go. This was why they had erased her. "I tried to get it to the police before," Isabel whispered, her energy fading. "The day I disappeared. I had a meeting with a journalist, someone I thought I could trust. But they were waiting, Reeves's men. They took everything, my bag, my phone, but they missed this." Her fingers brushed the locket. "I kept it hidden, all these years, waiting." The sheer willpower it must have taken, the resilience to protect this tiny, damning secret through a decade of unimaginable trauma, was staggering. His Isabel, even broken, was still fighting. Suddenly, the muffled bass from outside seemed to intensify, and with it, the sound of hurried, heavy footsteps in the corridor. Loud voices, angry and urgent, were approaching their door. Isabel's eyes widened in terror. "They know," she gasped. "Someone saw you come in. Someone talked." Michael's mind raced. He had the truth. He had the evidence. He had Isabel. But they were trapped in the heart of the hornet's nest. The twist was not just finding her, or even the evidence. The twist was that the discovery itself had sprung the trap. The decade of silence was about to be shattered by a violent confrontation. He looked from Isabel's terrified face to the locket in his hand, its explosive contents suddenly feeling like a burning weight. The fight for Isabel's life, and for the truth, had just entered its most dangerous phase.